So, thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transportation. Uh, and as I said just now before I started recording, uh, this is going to be I'm framing this as a critique of a certain video that went, I don't know if viral is the right word for this. I would not know whether something has gone viral on YouTube. But it certainly generated a lot of discussion, called Urban Planning YouTube Has a Huge Problem. This is the link. It is posted in chat. And I will give people time to, you can copy the URL. This is a URL. YouTube works entirely on the basis of URL shortener. Now, I will say, I have not watched City Nerd's reaction. All I know is that, I think I've watched maybe the first 5 minutes of it, but not everything. Yes, you can see what kind of cringe music I listen to. And so, I will say that it's not going to be a live react. Instead, and I'm not going to play this on stream. I warned people on social media, watch this before I'm streaming, because I'm not going to make it a live react. Instead, I'm going to summarize what the nth review is saying. No, Hikoki, you are not late. So, the nth review is, I think, mostly critiquing not just bikes. When he says urban planning YouTube has a huge problem, he's talking about a bunch of people, and he generally references them with a lot of respect, like City Nerd, or even not just bikes. But he complains about a certain trend there. The trend being, I discovered this maybe last week when someone was playing it in like a rhythm game. So yeah, so what he's pointing out, so he's based in Colorado Springs, and he points out that urban planning YouTube is, to him, very introductory, or rather, so he, for example, says, yet another person tells me that I should read Jane Jacobs. Now, Jane Jacobs is kind of the starter text of urbanism, and I don't think it's a good starter text for urbanism, but eventually someone is going to need to write like a 20,000 word takedown of Jacobianism, and I'm pretty worried that's going to have to be me, like an anti-Jane Jacobs FAQ or something. But I mean, I will not deny that she's like an important standard reference. Yes, everyone either has read her or pretends to have read her. It's like talking about a history of New York City and then saying you should read The Power Broker. Everyone has either read The Power Broker or pretends to have read The Power Broker. And I leave it up to you to guess which category I am in. And so things like that everyone knows, like what the basics of walkable and bikeable cities should be like, and so on. And then he says that and then he goes into how there's not a lot of connection between people who are watching these vlogs and actual praxis. And so here's already a kind of a dual critique. The first is that the urbanist vlogs are very, I don't know what to call it, maybe 101. Very introductory, this is what a bikeable city is like, very broadly, which, at least from the ones that I'm watching, I don't think that is correct. So, I will admit that the one that I'm watching the most is not among the ones he critiqued the most, and that is the one that I'm probably watching with, probably most connected to, is RM Transit, where what he does, there is, the basics of what good transit is supposed to be, but what he will say is, look at this specific piece of public transit infrastructure. Is it good? And he will, so often it's like, so I think the value in that is applying the basic, it is applying these basic principles to specific things and then seeing how they work. And then, and the advantage of this is that, to shift it to a very different environment for a moment, in any high-profile trial, it's not just the defendant that's on trial, but also the system. In that, depending on how the system rules and in using what reasoning, the system itself may gain or lose credibility on this. And it's very important. It's very obvious with trials of corrupt politicians, but not just with corrupt politicians, also with other very high-profile cases. I mean, the United States, maybe O.J. Simpson is a big example. With Epstein, if it had gone to trial, it absolutely would have been there. With Israel, like, Netanyahu isn't so much on trial as the system is on trial in a sense. And going back to urban planning and infrastructure, when I say the system is on trial, what I mean is, okay, we have these basic principles for good transit, and then we apply them to a specific project. And in the same way that we judge the project by these principles, we judge the principles by the project, or by the slate of projects. So, if we have a slate of principles that say that you should, let's say, shut down the New York City subway and run buses in it, it's a take that sounds unhinged, but Randall O'Toole, I don't think, ever recanted it. He actually said it to me, I think, never backed down from it. His idea is that buses are always more efficient than trains, and as a result, even where subway tunnels exist, they should be turned into some kind of BRT. And now, this is a take that's very obviously unhinged, and when we work through why it is unhinged, maybe we can understand that the bus good, train bad school of planning, at least if it's that oversimplified, then it's obviously wrong. Now, there are less oversimplified less oversimplified versions of the bus good, train bad principle that will not say run buses in the New York City subway tunnels. These variants are also, I think, rather stupid, but at least you can start nuancing by saying, okay, wait, maybe let's say in the case of buses and trains, and it will go to so high-speed rail loses money ever, well, just false. That's not even like a bad principle. That's not even a principle that you judge by what it recommends. This is a principle that you judge by looking through the finances of the mainland JRs, through the finances of SNCF, through the finances of Deutsche Bahn, and then you realize that, lol, no. With buses and trains, there really is an issue where a lot of Sunbelt cities in the United States that are building light rail are losing copious amounts of money on this. We're talking like $5 or $6 in subsidy per trip, buses and trains. Oh, hey, Evelyn. So so with this principle, where if we take this principle, bus good, train bad, and we like try to see what the reasoning for it is, and then we realize, wait, but obviously it's bullshit that you should be running buses in the New York City subway, you can start thinking, okay, maybe it's about how busy the lines are. So on very strong lines, you definitely need rail. Maybe you look at things like maybe you look at things like good BRT practices, which is not something that I've ever seen out of the anti-rail movement. I have seen it from people who are predominantly pro-BRT and also oppose rail. For example, the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP. They dump on trains a lot, and they're incorrect to do so. But they spend a lot of effort on actual good BRT principles. So you can read these and see that maybe metro lines would not make good BRT. Like, these are not good. These would not turn into good BRT. They cannot be open corridors. You don't have the space for maneuvering the buses in and out of the route. Obviously, it's a physically separated right-of-way, but the separation is designed around the needs of trains, not buses. And once you do that, you understand why the bus versus rail mode warfare, if you're thinking buses over trains, no, I don't think it. I honestly don't even think it's through the North Shore line somehow. Even that is not, I think, a good BRT corridor, because the BRT corridors need to let buses go in and out of the corridor, to like branch in and out of the corridor, and also they should probably be a major street, which historic rail rights of way are bad at. And so the point is that, and so going back to the issue of urbanist YouTubes, just taking these principles and seeing how they apply to specific projects, and again, this is something that I like Reese Martin about a lot, like Arab Transit, but also, I mean, lots of stuff they say on City Nerd, like he talks about which high-speed rail corridors the United States should build, and that is both a judgment of those corridors, but it's also a judgment of his methodology, and I've nitpicked him on that before, on that point before. So this is something where actually starting with these and applying them on a case-by-case basis helps validate the principles, or, I mean, validation can also fail, or show that they need to be nuanced or nitpicked, or in some cases, just completely replaced. And completely replaces what I think about Jane Jacobs, but again, that's a separate discussion. And so to start with, I don't think that these vlogs are necessarily bad. Now, I'm being very circumspect about this, and none that I'm doing this kind of New Yorker style article in which I'm talking about the topic more than about the stuff that's being critiqued. And the reason I'm doing that is I don't actually religiously watch these vlogs. It's possible that I'm spending more time vlogging on YouTube than watching urbanist and transit vlogs, but also I make massively long videos, and the normal videos are like a couple minutes long. Like this is 20 minutes, and Arm Transit, I think he usually tends to be about 10 minutes, I think. Like the kind of the standard length is about, I think this point about around 10ish minutes, so I'm talking about length, not number of videos. But nonetheless, I mean, from what I say, I don't think it's this. I don't think they're very oversimplified. So it is useful, I think. And the back and forth is again also very useful because you judge these principles in the same way that. So I when I saw this, so this is from 13 days ago, but I didn't see it immediately. I saw it when I saw that City Nerd was doing the React, so it was yesterday. And so when I was seeing that, and I figured I need to respond to I need to watch this and then respond. I was announcing this on Discord, and people were talking about learning about urban planning and public transit from 2020's vloggers or from like 2010's pedestrian observations posts. And one of the things that I pointed out is quite a lot of my blog posts you need to read with a comment thread. Like you need to, I think I refer to it on Discord as Talmudic, like the disputations, where we actually do need to see what people say in comments, which is not always positive toward my point. But yeah, I accept that. And so that's, I think, where it actually is valuable to learn just from seeing the disagreements and seeing and seeing specifically again how these principles apply to specific cases. This is, and I'm repeating this phrase just because one of the things that I've noticed is usually the quality of comments, it's not just on my blog, on transit blogs in general, tends to be high. Now, there's this kind of line, don't read the comments, and then, yeah, if you're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, do not read the comments. The comments will tell you nothing. Also, usually the original post will tell you nothing as well, but the comments will be even worse. But when you are taking a subject where there's a giant base of knowledge out there, yeah, having someone say, here's how this applies where I am, that matters. That actually helps. because there are always these corner cases, and I mean, so all I know of Colorado Springs, so as I said, that review is based in Colorado Springs, which I will summarize to you everything that I know about that place. It is a metro area of, I think, 600,000 people. And I'm actually going to check this. It is home to the United States Air Force Academy, and it is politically very conservative. Okay, so the city proper is 500, but it is very sprawly. Like, this is how dense it is. Metro, yep, I said 700, and I got it very close. So I'm pointing out that I don't actually know Colorado Springs, and now, any principle that I talk about from my knowledge of, I don't know, I want to say not a bunch of transit-oriented cities because I lived in Providence for a year, but transit-oriented cities plus Providence, or if Boston counts in transit-oriented cities plus Boston plus Providence. And then Reese is, I think, based in Toronto. I don't remember where City Nerd is based. Not just bikes and moving to the Netherlands, I believe. So all of these things, I mean, sometimes, yeah, we can talk about, oh, these are how you apply these principles in various kinds of auto-oriented cities. But at the end of the day, seeing how this applies to oh, his video, yeah. So, and I'm actually going to get to the YIMBY movement. Because I think the YIMBY movement is the big reason why he's broadly wrong. But I haven't even gone through that part of the video. And so so just the sight of how these things apply to smaller cities, I think that matters. Like watching, so there was this example that I don't remember if I ever vlogged about. I blogged about it, where a couple years ago, now I can't link to Twitter anymore because Twitter became entirely gated. So this is when it happened. So 2018. So what happened was Sandy Johnston, I think at the time he wasn't yet working for the Boston Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, or now I think the MBTA. So he was on social media a lot, and he was talking about this specific bus in South Sioux City, Nebraska. This is Sioux City, I think Iowa. I think it's at the tri-point of Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota, where the city center is on the Iowa side. So this is the bus route, and essentially we start saying how horrible it was. A bunch of us on Transit Twitter just redesigned the entire bus system by Twitter, and you can read this post. I mean, this is the name of the post. Is how I search for it. But just being able to see how bus principles about frequency and straightening routes in a toy case, and this is a city that I don't think any of us on Transit Twitter have been to. And maybe the Americans know people from there. I do not know any person who is from Sioux City or environs. I don't know anyone who has told me that they've even been to Sioux City. So again, we're just looking at it on a map and seeing how this works. And if someone and I think Jared Walker was talking about Lifeline Transit, and we were pushing back about how Lifeline Transit still needs to be mildly useful. So again, I don't know what Colorado Springs compares with that. I think it's larger than that region. But just talking about that, I mean, something where someone who's more experienced in like travel analytics can say, oh, so this is how you do it in this way. And bear in mind, even our Sioux City redesign is based on scaling down things that we knew from cities with actual public transit. This is why I was referencing night buses as like as a template. Not just Spike lives in the poshest neighborhood of Amsterdam. Okay. I don't actually know anything about Amsterdam neighborhoods, and as a result, I wouldn't even be able to say what is posh. Whereas in Berlin, for example, I can tell you what is posh and what is not, and they're essentially two completely distinct definitions of. It's not really posh; it's middle class here, which is people who speak German, the people who speak English. So generally, the very bürgerlich German-born Berliners are here, or like the more historically middle-class areas. So especially Charlottenburg and Wilmersdorf, like that entire part of the city. And these suburbanize more easily to I mean, for example, Wannsee. So I mean, I know Wannsee because of the Wannsee Conference House, of course. But the reason the Holocaust was being planned here this was an upper middle class area, like a very very early suburbanization. So that's kind of German posh, and then for people who are like usually pan-European, and often even work in English, not in German. Yeah, these neighborhoods exist, but because it's entirely a post-Cold War construct, I mean, we think about city center and not about city west. So it's stuff like Mitte, Friedrichshain, Prenzlauer Berg, and Kreuzberg. But anyway, so also, yeah, again, I don't know. I mean, I don't know not just bikes well enough. I know there's been a flame war, and I'm not gonna wade into that flame war because I don't know enough. As I said, I don't watch these vlogs very much. Apparently the flame war was triggered by him saying that American cities are beyond saving or something, and he enjoys living in the Netherlands or something. By the way, about people who can't afford to tram to work. In Berlin specifically, there's no such thing as can't afford to tram to work. So bikes and trams are sociologically different in Berlin. What we're talking about, like nuances of these things. So even though green advocacy tends to be pro-bike, pro-tram, and anti-subway, bikes and trams are sociologically different in European cities. Certainly in Berlin. Now, in the United States, it's different because in the United States, if you translate tram as downtown streetcar, it's entirely people say it's a development tool or a gentrification tool, and it is neither of these things. Upzoning is a development tool. The streetcar is isomorphic mimicry of public transit. It's at a scale that's far too small. This is the problem with American downtown streetcars. I am unfamiliar with any exception. No, Portland is not an exception. Even the ridership there is kind of silly. Now in Berlin, the way the trams work is, you might be able to see it on this map. The trams are mostly East Germany because West Germany replaced nearly all of the trams with car infrastructure, with subways and with Stadtbahn tunnels, so subway tunnels that outer urban trams would feed into, which is why the Greens are so negative on them, on subways. And but in the Eastern Bloc, this never happened. So the busiest tram networks in the world are cities that were Eastern Bloc for the most part. I believe globally the top 4 tramway networks are Praga, Budapest, St. Petersburg, and Paris. And of course, Paris is post-Cold War like tram revival. It's circumferential trams, the core radial trunk routes are subways, are métro and RER, and but also Paris is a much larger city than all of these, than the other 3. In fact, metro area, I think it's probably about the size of those 3 combined. And in Switzerland and Austria, they also kept the trams. So the point is that the trams are not just for the rich. Biking means you live close enough to work, that you can bike. It's like a range of, I don't know, 4 or 5 kilometers. And Berlin is monocentric if you think of the center as something very large like this. It's not all monocentric if you think in terms of like this or this or this. So these are all a bunch of subcenters, but they're all inside the ring. And usually if you can bike, maybe if you're working around Warschauer Straße, and maybe you can bike from Lichtenberg, but for the most part, biking is something you do if you live relatively close to work, which means you're either on rent control or middle class. Now, trams are very different. The trams do go pretty far out into East Berlin. So, I mean, yeah, there are trams all over here and here. It's not way past Lichtenberg. And so it's not about being able to afford to tram. And this is something, again, this is something this is something that is very specific to the history of Berlin with the Cold War, because it was divided, so the East maintained the trams and the West didn't, so the tram network looks kind of funny. Whereas in, for example, Zurich, there's the tram network. It's like, I mean, the center of the tram network is city center, and the same is true in Prague and in Budapest, I imagine. In Prague, no, in Budapest, I imagine. I don't remember which is which between Buy American and Buy American. Every time I write about this, I need to look this up. But yeah. Yeah, the United Streetcar debacle was a debacle. But anyway, so this actually does matter, this detail, because often it's just a giant toolkit. Like, urbanism needs to be thought of as a very large toolkit in which I think I know a fair amount about this, but there are always tools that I'm missing. And there are always people who are nitpicking me in comments, and the most annoying thing is when they're right. Like, as an example, someone just nitpicked, and I counter nitpicked about Taiwan in my comments, that sending me a link to the model splits in Taiwan by city. So the entire country looks like it's decently transit oriented. The trip to work transit model split in Taiwan in 2016, which was the last year that was available in that report before Corona, was 18%. During Corona, there was a small dip. In, for example, the UK and US, there was a much larger dip. Or in Germany, there was a much larger dip. In Taiwan, there was a small dip. It was the Corona fortress in 2020, but there was still a small dip in, for example, Taipei MRT ridership. And the metro area of Taipei was 31 or 30, was 31 point, I think it was 32%. I think it rounded to 32%. The combined area of Keelung, Taipei, Xinbei, and Taoyuan. And then the secondary cities were bad. Now, I countered it because the commenter said they're America bad, and they're not America bad. They're like America bad if you define America as Boston, Chicago, Seattle, Philadelphia, Honolulu, but these are more transit oriented than, let's say, Houston, Atlanta, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, things like that. And so that's kind of nitpicks and counter nitpicks about like how transit oriented is a country that I do think about how its transit planning works or doesn't work. Just seriously, vast base of knowledge, and in countries that don't speak English natively, this knowledge will rarely be published in English. Like in Germany, practically the entire discussion of public transportation is in German, not English. In France, it's in French, not English. It's possible that it's more readily accessible in English in the Netherlands and in the Nordic countries. But I don't even know how to tell Holocaust jokes in Dutch, let alone any other command of the Dutch language, so I can't actually tell you if there are things that you need to learn Dutch to know about how, for example, Utrecht rebuilt its platforms, things like that. And so, in Sweden, I managed to write the report without Swedish, but that's because a lot of their procurement, and by a lot I mean all of their procurement, has to be done in English because they're attracting international firms. So the point is that you have to be incredibly broad. We could not have written the construction cost synthesis without Elif and Marco for stuff that's really only available in Turkish and Italian. It would be a better report if we'd had more budget to hire more people so we could write with Korean knowledge or Russian or Chinese or Japanese. Oddly enough, Spanish might actually. I say or Spanish, but Eric speaks Spanish. And the upshot is that this is something where it may look basic, but it really isn't. And that's where I think it's really important to actually keep this kind of knowledge base and not just do what the interview is exhorting people to do. And this is getting to where to what Evelyn said about joining Open New York. So he starts by saying that he says step one is very basic, and then step two is people not really involved in urban politics. And his example, and then he says a bunch of things that I don't think are really right. So the first thing is to clarify, when I say first, I mean first in how I'm presenting it. This is not the chronology of how he presents this, as far as I remember. So, for example, he gives the example. He talks about how urbanists give testimonies at city council meetings or zoning board meetings that don't really engage with the local material. They just repeat urbanist tropes and they annoy everyone. So he says, okay, don't be annoying, work within the power structure. And then, then he talks about the importance of various local power structures and things like how the local elections have very low turnout. So if you do some retail politics and do some local persuasion, then you can actually effect change. And again, when I say then, I'm not making an assertion about the order in which he presents things. Then he talks about other issues, and he says it's not all about urbanism, because what about racism, and what about, I think he talks about food deserts and parks. And honestly, that's where it loses me, because racism is not a local issue. If you think that you are solving racism by engaging in any kind of local politics, you are failing. And the same is true of economic inequality in general, by the way. There's a reason the expression tiny town justice in the United States never refers to anything that is recognizably a just system. It is entirely a system of in which the local notables can do whatever they want, and if you don't like it, it's obedience, emigration, or the graveyard. Steubenville, Ohio. So the case where I think there was this family that was run out because their teenage daughter, I think, was complaining about being harassed, maybe assaulted by, I'm forgetting whether the son of the school principal or the son of the mayor, but basically it played to a trope that's very well known and is fundamentally correct. If you know Tom Lehrer, then look for the song "My Hometown," I think. It should be performed, but we can read the lyrics, because I'm using the fiction that everyone already knows. People say enshittification, but this way it's much easier for me to find the lyrics. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's exactly something you can also see about with racism in the United States, where it was upheld entirely through local structures. So, for example, the voter registration was entirely local, and if a black person tried to register, then the White Citizens Council would be notified, and the Citizens Council would notify the KKK, and the KKK would helpfully light up, would brighten the light of the black person's lawn with a burning cross to make it clear who gets to vote and who doesn't. These are the lyrics. Yeah, this. Again, it's like, this is not something that I'm telling you that's like some kind of brave truth-telling that's never been said before. This is very well known. And the history of American racism is, again, it's exactly that. It's all about local structure. So eventually when states and the feds tried to do something about it, more the feds and probably the states which were doing massive resistance, in the 50s, they passed a law saying that you had to, that there, the crime of not registering black voters was one that required a jury trial. So the jury would be all white and obviously acquit the election officials who refused to register black voters. This is an example that I know of just because of the connection with like more modern conservatism, because Bill Buckley defended that practice of jury trials for people not registering black voters on the explicit ground that black people were a less advanced race, and therefore it was useful to find ways to block them from voting. And this was, I'm forgetting what year, maybe 57? Late 1950s, as I recall. And so there was a brief moment in the early 60s in which he was kind of pro-civil rights, Buckley, before saying that like race riots are like the worst thing in the world, worse than the Holocaust, because the Holocaust only targeted Jews or something like that. So so racism was something that was very local and was being resolved through coercion, through top-down coercion. So anti-racist praxis in the United States involved being locally annoying, doing a lot of local activisms that worked as provocations, things like sit-ins. The point of the sit-in was not to integrate the specific bar. The point was they knew that the local police would shit bricks and would beat up people who were just sitting there. People who were not just sitting there, but people who had been trained at churches, for example, to about how to be non-threatening. There's a reason they, for example, picked Rosa Parks to be the person who would refuse to get up for a white person on the buses, because she was picked to be non-threatening, and then they essentially made moves that were annoying, not to the South. The South knew exactly what they were doing, but the white South in the United States was not a majority of the population. It was not a majority of the voters. The North, by which I mean anything except the South in this context, was a very large majority of the country. They did not think Jim Crow was a good thing. As I understand it, from the moment there was modern polling in the late 1930s, with Gallup, for example, there were issue polls, and the American public was not pro-Jim Crow. It was just, it didn't care very much, unless they were black. And I mean, there were more white Southerners than black people, and certainly there were more enfranchised white Southerners than black people. And they were overly empowered through the committee system in Congress. So a lot of the civil rights activism, even when it was local, it was aiming at national level change. And this is what happened, was desegregation of the army, for example. So race-conscious policies were things like desegregation of the U.S. armed forces under Truman, which continued under Eisenhower. So the army and the Marines resisted. I believe the Navy and the Air Force were okay with that, but the Army and the the Army and the Marines, I believe, kept resisting, and because Eisenhower was himself a legendary general, it was easier for him to coerce the army on this. And in the 50s, essentially, the two parties competed about who could be more pro-civil rights entirely at the federal level through things like the enforcement of Brown, the enforcement of Brown versus Board of Education. Like they were literally sending federal troops to protect black children going to school. Yeah, but it's not just this is not just the military. So I'm giving military examples, but this was also coercion of the local through Supreme Court rulings. The Supreme Court rulings also in the 60s that established one person, one vote, the various Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. These were massive crowd boosters. These were, so for example, the big Civil Rights Act of 64 was, yeah, exactly. When the Civil Rights Act were actually being passed, they were passed with practical unanimity outside the white South. I think in 64, practically every person not representing the white South voted for the Civil Rights Act. So the white South was at the time Democratic, so this is how we had more Republicans than Democrats as a share of Congress voting in favor, but outside the white South, everyone pretty much voted yes on this. This was a massive, again, this was a massive crowd pleaser. So Martin Luther King, for example, had positive net approval in 64 and 65. Not in 66 and 67. 66, 67 he had negative net approval, partly because race riots, partly because he was very stridently against the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War was tragically, at the time, popular with the American public. But in 64, 65, I mean, I'm not saying Martin Luther King was massively popular, it was not, but he had positive net approval. So with racism, it's not something you ever fix at the local level. In fact, 50 or so years of trying to fix racism in the United States at the local level have produced no results whatsoever. So race-conscious policies worked at the federal level. Race-blind policies can also reduce the extent of racism. The example that I keep going back to is that the extent of the racial wage gap in France, as far as I can tell, and I don't have a link for this. I found this once on Twitter and I can't find this again. For people, so I think it's the wage gap facing people with non-European migration background who were born in France. So it's excluding immigrants. But in the United States, the black-white wage gap is for, there are very few black immigrants in the United States. This is how, in the United States, you kind of have to do the same exclusion because Hispanics, not sure about now, but 15 years ago, Hispanics in the United States faced a wider wage gap versus white Americans than black Americans did. This is despite the fact that there were studies that were investigating racism against both groups at once, so comparable methodology, and racism against black people was very clearly the worse. It's just that many Hispanics are immigrants who speak poor English, so, I mean, at some point, that's not discrimination if someone doesn't speak the language very well. But if they're locally born children speak the language, and so if you don't hire them, that's just racism. And of course, black people in the United States speak English. And so in France, they were breaking down the wage gap by whether you're born abroad or in France. And now in Europe, except in the United Kingdom, we don't keep statistics on race, but we have a circumlocution for this, which is called non-European migration background, which means usually it's first or second generation immigrants from outside Europe. It's usually done by hypo descent, so one non-Euro. So if you have one native-born parent and one migrant parent, you count as having migration background. Sweden is the odd one out. You need both parents to have migration background to count as both parents to be immigrants to be migration background. But anyway, so in France, I finally at one point found these figures, and there was actually a narrower wage gap there for annual wages than in the United States for black people. Now, by most accounts, there's more racial discrimination in France than in the United States. But France has much less inequality than the United States. Now, in the United Kingdom, which has roughly the same inequality as France, geographic inequality, massive geographic inequality, even worse than France. And this actually favors people of color in the UK because in Europe, people of color, so this is British inequality at this point, it's the same as Germany or France. And I mean, yeah, it's because the economy in the United States kind of, in the United Kingdom was kind of bad, and it's bad from the top with London finance, but still. So the point is that in Europe, at any rate, we have in Europe we have racism that's different from the United States. I think overall the level is probably about the same. Like racial discrimination depends on country. Again, I think it's worse in France, worse in the Nordic countries, worse in Switzerland, worse in Austria than the United States. Probably less bad in the UK or Germany. Representation is much worse in the United States. Like there's much more celebration of hyphenated cultures in the United States that does not exist here. And then police brutality here is more racialized, but at levels that are orders of magnitude, like 1.5 orders of magnitude less bad in the United States. So, and also lower inequality. Like I showed you, the journey in France is 0.3, and the United States is like 0.37, 0.38. So that's the big thing. And again, in the United Kingdom, separately, it's immigrant minorities. So immigrants move to richer regions like London. So the race-blind things are things like where minorities live, but that's national policy essentially. And is there full employment. And right now, there's been a steep decline in the hourly wage gap between black and white Americans in the last 3 or 4 years, just because there's full employment. And this is also, I think, something that has similar implications with like gender inequality. So a hardcore racist employer will just not hire women, will just not hire minorities. Usually employers who discriminate against racial minorities also discriminate against women and vice versa. But someone who's just mildly racist or mildly sexist will look at women or will look at racial minorities if there are no more white men to hire. And that's how labor-intensive growth or full employment can actually reduce racial inequality or reduce gender inequality. So for example, in World War II in the United States, there was a massive decrease in economic inequality, and this also started letting black people into the labor force, into like the organized industrial labor force. So these race-blind policies were, again, entirely federal, things like full employment policies, and that's not something that localism is at all relevant to. And now, again, in Europe, as I said, we have racism probably to a comparable extent to the United States on average. Some places better, some places worse. Some aspects better, some aspects worse. But we don't have the same history. Like in the United States, the history of racism is like, 350 years. Slavery is like from early 17th century Virginia, but it took a couple decades to reify to the rule that black people were chattel slaves, white people were indentured servants. So, and here, yeah, I mean, the normative Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries were racist, but they were colonialist about it. A handful of racial minorities who made it to Europe were actually treated pretty well. Like with Ho Chi Minh, there was this, there was this aspect where he said that as he was boarding the ship to go from Vietnam to France, where in France it was working class. I think it was a cook. he said that the closer the ship got to France, the better he was being treated. In Vietnam, yeah, it was treated as like a colonized class. Someone was inferior to the white French. In France, it was just another working class French. So here it may be a history of classism, and it gets maybe much more overt in the United Kingdom than here. But even that is something that's not fixed through anything local. And the reduction in inequality in the United Kingdom came through World War II and then through post-war policies like the NHS. And conversely, increases in inequality didn't come because there were changes in localism in the 1980s. No, they came because Margaret Thatcher, building up upon a generation of middle-class resentment at falling inequality, instituted a series of policies that intentionally raised British inequality. Same thing with Reagan and American inequality. So this is where forming these national networks or transnational networks is actually much more valuable and much more empowering than going to city council meetings. City council is not where things that matter are done. There's a reason people don't care. There's a reason that voters are not stupid when they vote in national elections. In every democracy that I know of, except maybe Japan, I think Japan is the big exception, but I believe it's true in Taiwan and South Korea as well. It's definitely true in Israel. It's definitely true in Jewish Israel. In Arab Israel, the turnouts in municipal elections might even be higher than in national elections, because in municipal elections, the different Arab parties compete with one another for who gets to govern, let's say, Nazareth. And then nationally, they still have a lot of resentment against one another, the three main Arab parties, Balad, Ra'am, and Hadash. But nationally, they're not really different from one another, to the point that when they ran on a joint list, this was viewed as trying to actually get national empowerment, and that oddly led to a large increase in Arab turnout, rather than someone who, let's say, hates Balad and voted Ra'am, seeing Balad and Ra'am run together made them more likely to vote for the joint list rather than less likely. But also Israel is only 20% Arab. So in Jewish Israel, people vote in national elections because they matter more than municipal elections. Like, who cares whether Ron Hulday or whichever rando is trying to replace him gets to do random local things. And yeah, Israel is an atypically delocalized society. Israel does not have regional accents. You need to be a total language geek to even know some differences in usage between in like the odd slang word that's different between Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem. To the extent their accents, they're ethnic, but I'm saying something that's not purely Israeli. I mean, this is something that highly federal systems like Germany or the United States have the same thing. Turnout is higher. In fact, it's the highest at the national level because that's the level that matters the most. And there are people who will tell you that the local matters. No, the local doesn't matter that much. Remember, the state of problems that were being identified, and the video, and to be clear, the interview goes into NIMBYism. He's not making a NIMBY point. He's saying that the NIMBYs currently dominate the local, and the answer is to kind of take back the local by urbanists insinuating themselves into the local power structure and doing a lot of local voting. And at least when it comes to housing, that's not how it works. So the way, and this is essentially the local level is where I won't even say good ideas go to die. It's where bullshit goes to bullshit. And this is where it's important to talk about the history of the YIMBY movement about housing. So the term NIMBY, I believe, goes through the 60s and 70s. And then I think the first citation of the term YIMBY is either end of 70s or beginning of 1980s. Yes, the vote. I mean, yeah, part of the problem is voter suppression. Like in New York, the voter suppression is especially bad, and it's just completely unremarked because it doesn't have a partisan impact. Well, maybe it does because the state legislature then prefers protecting incumbents to doing partisan gerrymandering, but it's but that's not voter suppression. That's different. But anyway, with YIMBYism, so I believe the history is that around beginning of 1980s is when people start using the term YIMBY about support for infrastructure, and it's used entirely notionally. It's something like getting to YIMBY, like how to get local communities to support the construction of big infrastructure projects. I believe Joe Lieberman might have even coined it, or been one of the early people talking about it. But again, it wasn't a movement. It was how to induce consent from the population. The term YIMBY as a movement for more housing goes back to 2000s Stockholm. And here we need to talk about Nordic culture a little bit. Nordic culture is incredibly individualistic. And a specific sense in which it is individualistic is that it is expected that you leave home at 18 and then live alone. The notion of housemates is basically unknown there. It exists in Germany, but is uncommon. It is much less common in Germany than in the United States, for example. Now, this comes in part from larger supply of micro apartments. So it's easier to just live in an apartment for one person that's not very large, so you can afford to pay rent on it. But the culture is not purely a response to material reality, but it can also shape material reality. So it's considered, it's an expectation within the Nordic countries that people move out of their parents' place when they're 18, and as a result, if that's not possible because rents are too high, that is considered a social problem. And what this means is that as rents rose from as the economy was recovering from the early 90s recession, from the early 90s financial crisis, due to disappointing levels of housing construction, people understood it was a problem early because Nordic culture says that it's a problem if someone who's 21 and wants to move to the city for some reason can't find housing by themselves. In the United States, the power structure says that the 21 is a dreg who is wrecking the city and needs to be disciplined by the 65-year-olds who will invent irrelevant things that the 21-year-old must be familiar with. And it gets to levels of hate that Jeremiah Moss of Jeremiah Moss, this is the so Vanishing New York, he said during the worst of Corona in 2020 that it made the city better because all the gentrifiers that he didn't like moved away. That's the level of hate that we're talking about that's normalized within American culture. And Nordic culture doesn't have that hate. They have different kinds of hate. As I said, they have worse racial discrimination than the United States, in Sweden, for example, but much worse. But the upshot is that they recognized early that it was a problem, that not enough housing was being built, so that's where the movement started. Now, the term YIMBY hopped over to the United States. I believe it started with New York YIMBY, distinct from Open New York. Open New York explicitly doesn't use the YIMBY term because of the history with New York YIMBY being a real estate publication and with San Francisco YIMBY being very aggressive. So New York YIMBY as a real estate publication didn't actually go very far. And then the term, so this is all early 10s, then the term made it to San Francisco under Sonia Traus, who established a YIMBY group called the San Francisco Bay Area Renters Federation, as opposed to Tenants Union, who are generally rather NIMBY because they essentially live off of rent control and off of extorting affordable housing amenities from developers. So they are NIMBY in order to be able to say no and force developers to bribe them, essentially. So instead of Tenants Union's Renters Federation, and also Bay Area Renters Federation spells BARF, because Sonia genuinely believes that there's no such thing as negative coverage when you're an upstart, and she is correct. And through being very in your face, she actually managed to attract some. She managed to attract notice of powerful people, but not necessarily local notables. Rather, it was, so first of all, it started with tech billionaires being YIMBY early on, and then Scott Wiener got in on the act, the San Francisco state senator, and essentially the YIMBY praxis, starting in, I think, 2017 is when they started doing where they started passing state laws on this. The praxis has never really been local. Like, yes, there's localism involved, but I mean, Sonia ran for city council. Like, in San Francisco, the board of supervisors, but it's a city council, and she lost. In fact, she came third. The person who was kind of viewed as the most, as maybe the least identified with YIMBYism, Matt Haney, won, and then became the YIMBYist representative because the neighborhood is full of people who came to the city very recently. I think Sonia was pointing out, and this was in 2018, that the median, I forget whether median resident or median voter in the district moved there in 2013 or something like that. It's like ridiculous. So that's essentially the neighborhood where people who moved to San Francisco recently to work and tackle. And so yeah, of course, that's an YIMBY interest group, but even then, San Francisco is not building more housing through local advocacy. There's some of that, but what's been much more successful, especially statewide, has been using state law to coerce the local, to essentially make it clear that the local doesn't do anything good. Now, the original idea, which was I think called State Senate Bill 827, which would establish a very generous minimum zoning envelope below which you were not allowed to downzone further if you were near public transit, like I think it was either a frequent bus or a train station. And they had to keep weakening it to gain more support, but that's entirely at the level of the state legislature, not at any kind of local level. And so the bigger successes have been in places that don't have California's politics. California's politics being it's a safely democratic state. Because it's safely democratic, there is no ideological choice in elections, leading to a very deep democratic deficit. All safe states in the United States have that problem. There is a reason why when you think about which governors in the United States could be running for president in 2028, on the Democratic side, I don't really think any safe state governors on that list. I mean, Hochul, Lal, Murphy, Lal, Healy, Lal, Pritzker in Illinois, and Newsom in California think they can do it. I don't think their names are high on the list as of now. The highest names on the list as of now are governors of blue-leaning swing states, so especially Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, but people are also talking about Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. Maybe some senators, maybe Buttigieg if he is more successful at the Department of Transportation. But essentially, the local power structure in these safely blue states, it's essentially the dominant party in such states is a corruption party. It's like, and this is something that by the way, it happens to parties that think of themselves as the dominant party, and they will be as flexible as needed to win elections because they don't care about anything except power. That happens. Like, the Austrian People's Party, ÖVP, they're kind of like the CDU of Austria, but much more corrupt than CDU. CDU, yeah, is mildly corrupt, but they do have an ideology. And even their moderates, like Merkel, have an ideology, and ÖVP is just pure corruption. In Italy, the Christian Democrats, Democrazia Cristiana. They were essentially a corruption party. They ran the government I think they ran the government continuously from the end of World War II to something in 1980, when they had, instead of corrupt Christian Democrats, they had the corrupt socialist Krasny. Now these parties no longer exist because they were obliterated in the anti-corruption investigations in Italy and Manipulita. The investigations are very important to our topic of public transit because the anti-corruption elements involved significantly reduced the construction costs of public transit in Italy. In the 1970s and 80s, Italian construction costs were the same as in the United Kingdom and in Germany. In the 90s, Italian construction costs fell. German construction costs slightly rose. British construction costs exploded. So in the United States, the safe states, you don't have ideological choice, because what the hell are you going to do if you're the average Californian? Vote Republican? No, you're not going to vote Republican. That would be insane. Maybe if you're an actual Republican, sure, but the average Californian is not a Republican. It's like saying, what are you going to do in Alabama in response to corruption? Vote for Democrats? I think would be great, but the average person in Alabama isn't ever voting for a Democrat in any ideological election. So the swing states is where it's at. I don't think it's a coincidence that the biggest YIMBY success in the United States on recent policy, I think it's been Minnesota/Minneapolis. Minneapolis has actually built a lot of housing, relatively speaking. But again, we're talking about recent increases. We're talking about which places in the United States just build the most housing in general. I think it's Pacific Northwest and Texas. But it's not so much that they've been YIMBY as they've never been as NIMBY as California and New York. Yeah, exactly. So, Evelyn, yeah. I'm talking about something very American right now, on purpose. Now, in Canada, they have provincial parties, so, and separately, the main provinces are contested anyway. I want to say that in most elections, the winning party, whichever it is, will also win both Ontario and British Columbia. Quebec is kind of weird because it depends on the Francophone ID poll. The Atlantic provinces pretty much always vote for Liberals, but they don't really have economies. Alberta always vote for the Conservatives, but at the provincial level, Alberta does actually have some competition. But separately, like in British Columbia, they have provincial parties. So most people who vote for the British Columbia Liberals don't vote for the federal Liberals. They vote for the federal Conservatives. So that's how they have party competition in Canada. Also separately, neither BC nor Toronto, I shouldn't say Toronto, neither BC nor Ontario has nearly so much local empowerment as the American states do. Yes, okay, if the person is Canada unique with having provincial parties, define unique. Like unique in the Anglosphere, I think Australia has the same parties at the state level as at the federal level. I'm not sure. I don't know anything about New Zealand. In the United Kingdom, it's the same parties, it's the Labour and the Conservatives, but the United Kingdom is also atypically unitary, and also historically London was contested. Remember, Boris Johnson was the mayor of London. Among federal systems, no, Germany does not have that either. Germany has the same parties federally at the state level, and it works because the multi-party system means that parties can shift. When they don't, that does lead to problems. In Bayern, CSU always wins, so CSU in Bayern is a corruption party. Now, federally, CSU runs as being the base of CDU. They will not go too far right, ever. In fact, Markus Söder, the governor, the minister-president of Bayern, has been, if anything, more strident in delegitimizing AfD than the current head of CDU, who is atypically conservative, Friedrich Merz, has, unfortunately. Fortunate that Söder says about them, I won't even meet them for a cup of coffee. Unfortunate that Merz is not so consistent. But locally within Bavaria, they're kind of a corruption party, and the things that they care about, when we talk about infrastructure again, suddenly these are incredibly expensive, and then the infrastructure projects that are not CSU priorities, like München U-Bahn expansion, is not especially expensive. Nuremberg U-Bahn expansion is actually very cheap. I don't quite know why, but Nuremberg, by far the smallest German city to have a full U-Bahn system. There are only 4 such cities: Berlin, Hamburg, München, and Nuremberg. Other German cities besides Nuremberg will have Stadtbahn systems, so maybe they downscaled, not downscaled in the sense of poor, downscaled in the sense of smaller scale, downsized some construction aspects of Nuremberg, I'm not sure, but they have pretty low construction costs. And then the München S-Bahn, which is more for the suburbs, so these are CSU voting areas. I shouldn't call it white. At this point, it's white flight, but historically it was conservative flight from the city, which was run by socialists, by the Social Democrats and now by the Greens. So for that, that's only the second S-Bahn tunnel in Munich. I think it might actually be breaching $1 billion a kilometer for the tunnel. It's that bad. No, in Germany we don't have state parties. I guess in Bayern they have the Freie Wähler, so that's people who are... It's essentially the CSU ideology without CSU, so currently they're kind of positioning themselves as a party that's to the right of CSU and CDU, but to the left of AfD. So they do a lot of right populist shit. They especially rose during the peak of... Maybe not peak of Corona, but a little bit after the peak of Corona, like 2021, 2022, because they were anti-vax, which does have a history in German conservatism. Anti-corona restrictions with like some libertarian affectations, and so essentially they're AfD without it. They're not AfD. They're CSU without CSU. But they're also trying to contest federally at this point. They're not purely provincial. They're not purely a Bayern party, and. So we don't have this in Germany, but we do have a multi-party system that lets Berlin have some kind of ideological competition. Now, separately in Berlin, we have garbage politicians on the left, but in the center left, or whatever you call Franziska Giffey, who's nominally center left. I don't think she is, but I think she's center right. But she's leading SPD. But we do have competition, and it matters. Yeah, New York has the Working Families Party, which is the silliest kludge ever. It's just, you vote for them and say, but I want you to be more left-wing, except that there's no leverage there, so it doesn't matter. The EU, no, okay, so about the EU is not a state. The United States is a state. Like, in the sense of the state, not in the sense of states being provinces. No, the EU isn't, and there's a reason. So, as I said, the highest turnout is federal elections, like national elections. The EU has much lower turnout than national elections. Because doesn't really matter if EPP or S&D gets ahead. They're not making any effort to distinguish themselves from one another. Everything is done through backroom deals. The EU Parliament is also very weak. It is not allowed to introduce its own legislation. The legislation has to be introduced into it by other much less democratic organs. And so the only time that you get semi-decent turn, for example, in 2019, was when the existence of the EU is at stake. So that was with surges in far-right parties, so people voted en masse to block them. That's successful. Yeah. The assholes are running Bavaria. This is something that you will not fix locally ever. You will fix it by coercing the local. You will fix it by maybe even coercing states. If the federal government finds ways to force localities and states in the United States to build more housing. In Canada, I think the Tories are trying to run on something like that, on being YIMBY, or forcing the provinces to be YIMBY. I can't tell to what extent it's real. I know that in the UK, it's been so the UK is very unitary, and the Canadian Tories are very clearly influenced by their British counterparts. Hence the kind of the YIMBY affectations. In the United States, the Republicans don't do that. In Germany, CDU does not do that. Here very broadly, the YIMBY parties are SPD and FDP. The NIMBY parties are the Greens and CDU. And so this is something where forming ideological national networks matters, and going to city council meetings really doesn't. At city council meetings, the problem is that everything is at such a low level of abstraction. You can go too abstract, but you can also go too specific, and it's so specific that it's about approvals for specific projects. And then what happens is the developers are basically obligated to bribe local actors. And if you're the sort of person who tries to organize against that, yeah, you can have very marginal successes, but that's not going to create more housing, because at the end of the day you will be replaced by someone who can bribe people better. Not for nothing, San Francisco likes Scott Wiener. There are polls about the approval rates of various city politicians. Wiener does by far the best. I think London Breed was doing okay as well. London Breed was running citywide on a platform of being more YIMBY. Her opponent, she had two main opponents in the election, in the contested election. The first one I think was 18. Jane Kim, and I'm forgetting the other guy. And Jane Kim was the most left-wing person on the Board of Supervisors, was explicitly running on a NIMBY platform. What she did, the way she launched her campaign, was she showed up at Forest Hills. San Francisco Forest Hills is a very wealthy, low-density neighborhood right on top of Muni Metro. I think it's maybe here. And said that she's against Forest Hills or West Portal. West Portal is so called because of the portal. Forest Hills on top. Not Hills, Hill, I guess. She showed up around here, saying that she's against. It wasn't SB 827 at the time. I think it was SB 50. The law that would coerce San Francisco and other parts of California with public transit to build more housing near public transit, or to permit more housing near public transit. And so London Breed won, not by a large margin. Wiener was facing a primary by a radical left activist named Jackie Felder, who was criticizing Wiener for his support for YIMBY bills. Wiener's agenda in the state Senate has been two big things. The first is YIMBY, and the second is queer rights. He's cis-gay, but he's very rooted in not just LGBT but LGBTQ advocacy, and he did a lot for trans and non-binary rights. And I have not seen left-wing criticism of him for not going far enough on that. I have, but the criticism I have seen of him, it used to be that he was pro-building more housing, which they said was pro-development, or like pro-developer. I think right now he's being criticized a lot for because he is not anti-Zionist. But this is like literally the last 4.5 months, and the man has been hated by the alt-left for, I don't know, I want to say 7 years at least, but probably less, but not, probably more than that. Like he had a lot of friction with with like radical left-wing people in like the gay rights community earlier. So Wiener won that primary. So in San Francisco, when there are elections where NIMBY versus YIMBY is the main issue, the YIMBYs win. Then the YIMBYs stay really popular in office. And again, I'm talking about Wiener more than about Breed, who has not actually delivered on that. She kind of transitioned to just stuff on crime politics. And then you would expect that when, I think it was SB 50 that narrowly failed in the Senate, but was actually ahead in Northern California. It lost because LA is very NIMBY, but in Northern California, more senators voted for than against. And you'd expect that in these areas where that's popular, they would just upzone by themselves, but no, they haven't, because the decisions are local. So that's a democratic deficit at the local level, and it's like saying organize to vote when you're deprived of the right to vote. So actually annoying people and reminding them that, no, actually there is a housing crisis, and most people want the housing crisis to end. Like, I mean, explicit YIMBYism is a crowd pleaser. Nobody runs on I'm NIMBY. They run on, well, we should make the developers pay for parks and affordable housing and whatever. And all of these things are just complete bullshit, to be clear. Like the extra parks, they're essentially just like bribery for the leisure of the people who are doing this. Like they're very efficient, the local notables, at demanding things that are only useful for themselves. Sometimes these are even private parks. In New York, there's the case of, I think it's called the Elizabeth Street Garden, where there's this private park that's being used as like, I think it's used as a hobby garden, but it's private. And the city was planning to convert it to, I think it was affordable housing for gay seniors. And essentially, like it has to be something that's that micro-targeted to even elicit enough sympathy for that to be at all viable, whereas I mean, there's only so much you can get through affordable housing subsidies while having American levels of taxation. Like, eventually you do run out of other people's money. Yeah, exactly. But yes, both of these things are correct. Yes, but not just. A lot of the beneficiaries of YIMBYism are already moving, or already in the city. Like, there isn't, like, New York might be a special case because of how rich it is, but certainly in a place like Berlin, YIMBYism is not going to turn from a city of 3.7 million to a city of 10 million. It's going to turn from a city of 3.7 to, I don't know, 4.5. Most of the beneficiaries already live here, but are not part of the local political structure. And I think it's even true in New York. Do I see a YIMBY in New York go from 9 million to 13 million over a generation? Yeah. Do I see it go from 9 to 18, so most? No, I don't. And remember, New York is almost entirely renters, so among current New Yorkers, the ones who benefit from the housing crisis, there are such New Yorkers, but very few. So anyway, that's the issue with housing, and the thing, and it kind of matters that for example, and this is why in New York there was this moment, I think it was not really this moment where lower middle and middle class Chinese immigrant communities were rather YIMBY because it was like for their own consumption and that of their friends and family. I think that moment is increasingly just gone. Like they've increasingly suburbanized to the point that, for example, Flushing used to demand YIMBY upzoning, and I don't think it does any longer. Again, there are always people who want to move in, but I mean, like, net moves or net migration numbers, even to places that are very wealthy, are not like the difference between the, let's say, native-born population of Dubai and the population of Dubai. Like, it's not. Yeah, don't want to be forced to live with a parent. It's like, again, that's a Nordic culture where you can move to another part of Scandinavia, to another part of the country. So there's not much migration between the Nordic countries, but you move to another part of the country sometimes. But it's not like the entire country would empty as everyone would move to the capital. It's not. I mean, yeah, there would be more net moves to the capital, but Sweden is like 11 million people to 10.5 million people, I think, and Metro Stockholm is, I think, 2.5, 2.6. Like, it's not going to turn into from 2.6 to like 8 or anything like that. It's going to turn from 2.6 to 3.75. And so, like, YIMBYism is very useful, but let's not turn it into like the difference between this and like people living in containers. And about transportation, again, the politics of transportation are different. In Europe, it's especially different, because, as I said, the YIMBYs here are SPD and FDP. Pro-transit politics here is the Greens, sometimes Die Linke, sometimes SPD. It depends on the mode. Pro-subways, probably SPD is the most reliable in that, except, again, incompetent leadership. The Greens, again, they're against even very high productivity urban expansion, because the expansion is to areas where nobody votes Green because they're far out. Part of it is a local versus state or local versus regional breakdown. Like, I have never heard, so Anne Hidalgo was mayor of Paris when I lived there, and it was visible how she was doing road diets and improving. I mean, I didn't notice the bike infrastructure as much, but I did notice the improvements in pedestrian infrastructure over a short period of time. I don't remember her ever being associated with any expansion to the metro or RER or the trams. This was always something that was decided at a different level. I've not heard any people praise her from outside France over public transportation, just over bike bad stuff. So stuff like, are you running the subway system better or the bus system or the tram system better? That's not really at that local level, at least not in Paris. In London, it kind of matters. People do talk about the Boris bus. Like, Boris Johnson was kind of for public transportation. He was just really incompetent at it. So the Boris bus was rather expensive, but which, I mean, it still cost a lot less than an American bus. But European buses are cheaper than American buses. We have, I guess, a better industrial ecosystem for that. The United States does not really import European buses, or if it does, it's like once at a time. So the maintenance ecosystem does not know how to deal with that. It happened in, I think it was Oakland that got, I think it was Belgian buses that were unpopular because nobody knew what to do with them. But the point is that this is something where inserting yourself into local politics really won't do much. Can it do something in Paris? Yeah, it can. Paris had, maybe still has, competitive elections. Hidalgo is not popular in Paris. She survived the municipal elections because the opposition. Whatever Macron's party called itself that year, they changed it all the time. It was En Marche with the same abbreviation as Emmanuel Macron. And then they changed it, I think, to La République En Marche, or something like Ensemble. I'm forgetting all of the names, but at any rate, in the municipal elections, they wanted to run a candidate against her named, I think it was Griffon, Benjamin Griffon, I believe, but then they were facing an insurgent candidate from within the party, the Fields Medal winner that I don't know, that I'm blanking on the name of, where he literally listened to give a talk. I'm gonna just check this because it's gonna be not Hidalgo. Mayoral elections. Yeah, record low vote. Oh, you're not even telling me who. Okay, you know. Why do I not remember? Okay, okay, now I'm just kind of annoyed at myself for not remembering the name of this person, so... Cédric Villani. Yeah, so anyway... Yeah, this is what happened. Essentially, there was vote splitting, and yeah, it goes to second round, but I mean, the sniping made them unpopular, made both of them unpopular, and I think for good reason. So, but my point is that oh, thank you, yeah. So yeah, my point is that in Paris, there is political competition. So both of them are running to the right of Hidalgo. I can't tell you what the difference between Villani and Griveaux was ideologically. So for example, actually it led to a good, I probably would have ended up voting Hidalgo if I did, because as a European citizen I'm allowed to vote in subnational elections. Her NIMBYism annoys me, but they both they both proposed some kind of urban renewal project for Gare du Nord that was very clearly not about like creating more housing or jobs, but just giving it like, so there are lots of black people hanging out around here. Black people, Arabs, just because Gare du Nord is where the trains depart to the suburbs in the north and northeast, which are the working class ones. So I constantly I would hear from people, oh, this area is very sketchy. No, it's not sketchy. You're just not used to seeing black people in Paris. So they were backing some urban renewal project just as a way of like having the sort of demographics that they think are more moral or something. And so yeah, I mean, racism is like something that people vote on. There's this kind of line by gay rights movement, like general civil rights movement, you don't vote on people's rights, you constantly vote on people's rights. So that was, for example, something where there was ideological competition in Paris. Probably still is. Like, I mean, until the second rounds became Macron versus Le Pen, Paris leaned left, but only by a couple points. Like, I think in 2012, I want to say that, I don't know if they say it, I believe in 2012, Hollande won Paris 53-47 in the second round, and he won the overall second round by like 1 or 2 points, but by maybe 2 points. So he won Paris by slightly more than he won the national election. That's still ideological choice. Like as it happens, Paris has always had left-wing mayors for a long while, but one party wins by a small margin and it does not make it a safe state. Everyone believed that made Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan safe states at the presidential level until 2016 happened. So my point is that telling people to insinuate themselves into a level of politics where with no democracy or with nothing that's recognizably democratic, it's kind of silly. Like it's not like you're not going to improve cities in the United States through going to city council meetings. You're going to improve them by coercing city council. You're going to improve them by having state policy and federal policy that cuts down city councilors to their actual size, and their actual size is that of a mouse. And again, this is where YIMBY as a movement in the United States has had successes. It's always been through very high level policy changes, like between state, not federal so far, but state, or sometimes the state forcing the hand of a municipality. It's not really been through local advocacy, not very much so, at least. And I think one of the problems with Open New York is that in New York, besides the fact that New York City Council works, has no democracy whatsoever, but also the state legislature has not been great on this. And as I said, remember I said at the beginning that like maybe midway through that someone like Pritzker or Newsom thinks that they can be president but probably can't. Hochul, nobody has any illusions about. So anyway, that's my take on local advocacy. Like, it's essentially hobbyist. It's essentially a hobby. Actual politics lives where there's ideological choice. That doesn't really exist at the local level. So you want to do advocacy, you can't just go to city council meetings. I mean, that's not going to be that relevant, not at scale. I mean, you're not going to get your integrated public transit system through anything local. The MTA is a state agency. I mean, I know there are people who think that the MTA should be a city agency. Okay, do you think Eric Adams would make things better? Now, you could argue that if the MTA were a city agency, that someone like Eric Adams would never be put in charge of it, but, I mean, Eric Adams was known to be a piece of shit before the primary, and yet the city political elites made sure that he would win. Like, I wouldn't say made sure that he would win. Like, it wasn't like it wasn't like the election was rigged or anything. But for example, Bill de Blasio was behind the scenes working in favor of Adams and against Catherine Garcia, who was his own appointee. So yeah, New York could have had a better mayor. Like, Adams did not win by a large margin. But like, I don't see a city-run MTA as something that would genuinely solve these things. And I mean, yeah, if New York State were told that you're allowed 5 or maybe 10 political appointees across all positions, across all agencies statewide, your call if the MTA is important to you that it gets one of them, it will never get more than one of them. That would solve things, but that's again political culture, in the same way that the Nordic political culture, not political but social culture, where it's expected that people leave home at age 18, that's helped lead to early YIMBY advocacy. And I've been talking about American successes. The Nordic success has been pretty noticeable. So in Norway, I've been told that the way that housing is done is through the idea that the state can just coerce municipalities is not unfortunately within the Nordic mentality, but the state can negotiate aggressively. So what this means is that the state will demand that a municipality approve more housing as a precondition of building infrastructure there. Now, because these are cities with strong centers, the Nordic capitals, the snob suburbs do want their trains to city center. And this is true of, for example, Munich as well. The Munich S-Bahn has the support of conservatives who live in the suburbs and work in the city, but don't want to be associated with the city. It's kind of like the LRR and Metro North in around New York, And very unlike suburbs of most American cities who don't even visit these cities for work, who don't even go to work in these cities. The Port Authority does not work either. Like, don't try to create more democratic deficit, and honestly, people should just not try to think that much about the org chart. The org chart is not the problem. Like the org chart, like which agency is lumped with which agency is not the problem. It matters that if you have something that has a lot of variations within the United States, it is not what's causing high construction costs, because high construction costs are a US-wide phenomenon. Yeah, it's worse in America than elsewhere, but but it's not like there's a good part of the United States on this. There isn't even a sort of okay part of the United States with us. So if it's something that's within the variation in the United States, things like liberals versus conservatives, that's just not the issue, which means that things like prevailing wages or the power of public sector unions in New York versus Texas is also completely irrelevant. Or the idea that there's the threat of conservative defunding. It's a very popular left-wing explanation for high American costs, and it's complete garbage. The funds should be raised by whoever can pay the lower interest rates. In Italy, for example, the problem is that the state was trying to keep the debt for construction of books, and that led to PPPs with 8% effective interest rate, assuming the ridership projections would be met, which they mostly are. So, don't fucking pay 8% interest on your debt in a developed country, ever, please. So yeah, so like trying to fiddle with the org chart, I don't think it matters very much. What matters is understanding, like with construction costs, what matters is understanding the failure of all of the United States, and to a large extent all of the English-speaking world, in the last generation or so. And yeah, and so it does. So with who runs the NTI, I don't think it's that important. No, if you want an agency that serves parts of the state, it's even a worse democratic deficit, because then technically the governor is not responsible. That's the MBTA issue or the SEPTA issue or the BART issue. No, seriously, don't try to fiddle with the org chart. That's not going to do anything. So in the same way, anyway, the Nordic mentality that it's good to move out at 18 led to more YIMBYism, and that's led to real results. Negotiations with snob suburbs that lead to building more housing, finding more land, like parkland that is not really useful for greenery, to redevelop. That's led to a large increase in how much housing they've been building in the Nordic countries. And let me see if I can find this. Yeah, this blog post, just because I actually found out numbers of housing construction in most developed countries for this. So Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. Now these are not very high numbers, but I mean, they're on the high side. Compare them. Okay, Switzerland is within that range, and Austria is above it, but like Belgium is below, France is below, the Netherlands. Oh my god, Germany. Oh my god, Britain. Southern Europe just doesn't really have an economy. It's starting to get one, but maybe that's not the best comparison. But Germany, Sweden, or Germany, Finland. And so that has helped, and rents in Stockholm cooled as a result. Shortly after I left, like, so I was living there at like kind of peak rents, and then they built housing, and rents didn't fall but kind of stagnated. And New Zealand had the same issue with Auckland, essentially inspired by American YIMBYs, but in an environment where the government can actually do things from time to time. It doesn't matter. Like the counties don't matter. Like the boroughs don't matter either. Yeah, so the so anyway, that mentality produced good outcomes in the same way the mentality that the local needs to be cut down to size, and again, the actual size of these local politicians is that of a mouse. That will produce better things, but you need to drop the idea that it's somehow more moral to attend zoning board meetings. These things, these elections are low turnout for a reason. The voters are not stupid. Most people have a distinction, like most people, even ones who are not like politicos or anything, like get there's a distinction between politics and village gossip. And when elections are at the level of village gossip, yeah, of course, people aren't going to participate. And yeah, that's the that's why I don't think that the 20 the late 2000s, early 10s ecosystem of public transportation blogs, or the more recent one, which is a different one, or the ecosystem of urban planning vlogs, I don't think there's something wrong with that. It actually is important to talk about good praxis. Not good practice, but like good best practice is not the same as good praxis. But also, yeah, talk about political practice. Like that's a valid form of discussion. I just don't think that localism like ends up working as praxis unless what you want is like more village gossip. And the and the upshot is that it's okay to talk about successes. And yeah, these successes, if you're American, I'm sorry, these successes are not in your country. Like, yeah, I can talk about Seattle being maybe YIMBYer, but it's not even recent political YIMBYism in Seattle or Portland. Yeah, I guess Oregon had the agreement to build more housing in exchange for a very loose, very loose rent control. Like, I think 7% annual real rises are permitted. To put this in perspective, California does not even permit you to raise rent at the level of inflation, so it forces real rent reductions, and then they wonder why they can't really build. And but for example, in Washington State, it's not exactly a matter of recent advocacy so much as they never became as NIMBY as California. Yeah, so with very partial examples of success, very, very partial, you can find one cluster of transit-oriented development in like the United States, which is certain suburbs of Washington, D.C. But at the end of the day, Washington, D.C. has a model split of like 15%, which is just not good for a city of that size. Sorry, not sorry. And that requires actually delocalizing how you think. Because someone who only cares about like random shit about local history, even if it's, I won't say even if it's narrow, but I would say especially if it's narrow, because the biggest cities are the ones that are most wrapped up in their own mythologies. In the mythology of London as a thing, that it actually matters to like study the history of London or of Berlin or of New York or of Paris, and nothing good comes out of it. You get people who refuse to learn from the rest of the world. I think it matters that Berlin and Paris have very old systems with their rolling stock costs. Now, the age of the system should not affect rolling stock costs in any way, shape, or form. New York did not have a rolling stock premium until maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago on the subway, but it has refused to update the way it does things because it's wrapped up in its own mythology. Paris, same thing. The LOL insists, and the LOL isn't even like an especially old system, but the LOL insists on its own. It insists on its own one-off, non-standardized designs for rolling stock. Rolling stock being probably the most standardized element of the systems of public transportation. And yeah, Paris does not have high physical construction costs, but then you look at the LOL rolling stock acquisition cost, and there's a pretty hefty premium. In Berlin, on the S-Bahn, they've had, on the U-Bahn, they've had some rolling stock let's just call them disasters and leave it at that. And again, this is a city where physical construction is not especially expensive. They just don't buy the standard, like, what's it called, Metropolis or Novia, or similar products, because they feel special. Like, when you feel special, you will not learn, and then other people will bypass you and you won't even notice. And they live in a pretend continent that was kind of economically bypassed because it was, for many reasons, but one of it was that it was wrapped up in its own superiority. So anyway, yeah, that's my rant about this. I don't think urbanist vloggers, at least the ones that I'm viewing, and again, I recognize that I'm not watching not just bikes very much. I'm watching things that are more public transit oriented than bike oriented, and yeah. Literally, I just watched a bike video about, let me see if we can find that. Something about how, it was an American who just visited Hamburg and talked about how, bike normalized, marginalized. Yeah, this. Despite what this red thing will show you, I watch the entire thing. I don't know why it thinks it's in the middle. I don't think this was a bad video, or a video that leads you to be politically unrealistic. It actually showcases a specific, both a specific way that I'm recognizing as someone who lives here, and maybe I've heard about how the Dutch do cycling, and maybe I'm noticing from this reminds me of how in Berlin I'm seeing that the cycle paths be on part of the sidewalk, and he explicitly talks about how most cycle paths in Germany, or at least in Hamburg and Berlin, are installed at the expense of pedestrians, not cars. And I recognize that as someone who lives here, and I recognize that as a kind of failure mode, and from the perspective of someone who does cycle, which I don't, points out actual problems with it, which are problems that are not very relevant to me because I'm not really involved in local politics in Berlin, but that someone who was involved in the local politics of a place that was interested in installing bike lanes should know, so that they would be able to point out, oh, and by the way, this is a pretty narrow bridge, so this is going to be a conflict, and it's really important to fight for, on this narrow bridge, that the bike lanes be at the expense of car infrastructure, not ped infrastructure. This has actually been a very useful video, which I randomly saw because it got linked in, I hadn't even heard of Schecter before. I saw it because it was linked, I think on Fetty, on Mastodon. But now I'm seeing it, and he seems like a pretty good vlogger, says things that make sense to me, and in fact make sense to me based on my having not a lot, but some local knowledge that he lacks because I live here and he doesn't. And he says something that makes a lot of sense to me about how Germany works. He's citing a German advocate who's talking about how in Germany cycling is normalized but also marginalized. Go watch that, it's good. You'll learn from these things. And yeah, so anyway, that's my extended rant. That kind of knowledge production is good. I mean, for someone who spends hours a week vlogging, I will say that I prefer reading over viewing and writing over vlogging, but evidently video is a thing. But this kind of online knowledge production actually is useful. I mean, please participate. Anyway, do people have questions about this? It's been, oh my god, almost 2 hours of recording. If not, we could probably add this after a tour and make it to our recording. let's. This is a lot. This is a lot of lag. I think I said at the beginning that the lag starts at like 10 seconds and then becomes much worse over time. Yeah, it's like almost a minute of lag, which is insane. We'll have the awkward moment. As I said, this is a unique stream in that I don't have chocolate or cookies next to me, so it's going to be water. Sure. Thanks for watching, Yoki. Oh, about my arm? Yeah, my arm is not fully healed, so I can fully, you can't see it, I can fully stretch it forward. I can't, so the position that I can't do is, so I can lift my arm with the help of the other arm. I can lift it up, but for some reason I can't lift it 45 degrees between up and to the right. So like if I try to move my arm into this position, not my hands, but like do the full arm stretch, then that I can't do. Thanks for asking. Are there other questions? Yeah, it will. I mean, what I have seems pretty scary, but that's because nearly all cases are like are chronic, and mine is acute. Like usually it's a strain. What is my main thesis is that that this particular video about how urbanist YouTubers have a problem, which is that they talk too much about basic concepts of urbanism and not enough about how to exert local power. That video is wrong. Like it's localism doesn't actually affect positive change. Like you can talk about things that are essentially village gossip, but you're not going to improve education through localism. There's a reason that good, cost-effective education systems don't empower tiny districts like the United States system does. There's a reason, and likewise, anti-racism in the United States or reductions in economic inequality, they are national policy basically. Like it's, so the big things are not urban, or not local. Urbanism is not local either. Like there's this belief in the empowerment of the local that is an incorrect belief. YIMBYism, for example, works at the national level. In the Nordic countries, there's a lot of spending autonomy. The Nordic countries have very high proportions of subnational government spending as a percent of GDP. Their universal healthcare systems, for example, I think it's Sweden, it's county-based. But like with full interchangeability, there's no such thing as inverse out of network. You live in Stockholm, you can get healthcare in Malmö. Honestly, you live in Stockholm, you can get healthcare in Berlin. Like the European universal healthcare systems have reciprocity. So like a lot of the welfare, not a lot of the welfare is local, but essentially with state supervision, big infrastructure mega projects, the state is highly involved. Housing development, the state, it's an important, like affordable housing is something the state cares about. Like there's no, oh, we don't care about this, it's just a local issue mentality there, and that matters. And I think they would be even better at infrastructure if they were more aggressive about coercing local NIMBYs than they are. So that's the problem with the idea that there's a problem with urbanist vloggers. No, urbanist vlogging is actually a good way of building national and transnational networks of people who understand how. I mean, I can talk about public transit. I mean, and someone like Not Just Bikes can talk about bike sport. But forming these transnational and national networks to first understand how things are done and how they could apply in a very local case. That is something that is much more valuable than dealing with like very petty localism. Does that answer your question? This is also a good summary for that. Yeah, sure, no problem. I think I'm gonna stop here. The summary question was a good place to stop. Thank you for coming. I will see you once again, either 4 days or a week. Topic TBD. So thank you and ciao ciao.